In 1709, the people of Europe faced their coldest winter in 500 years. Sudden storms, endless frosts, and vast famines led to the deaths of countless people over the next year or so, but the exact nature of the Great Frost remains a mystery to this day. It was called the Great Frost in England and the Grand Hiver in France, but whatever anyone wanted to call it, it basically meant everything had become very, very cold. And the weirdest thing is that it literally happened overnight. When people across Europe went to sleep on the evening of January 5th, 1709, they couldn't possibly have known what they were in for. When they woke the next morning, the temperature had plunged to the very bottom of the thermometer. Snow had begun to fall too, and it didn't stop either, covering pretty much the whole of Europe in a near instant. This new world had an average temperature of around -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Today, we can check the weather for the week and know that, while it may not be 100% accurate, we can get a pretty good idea of what's in store. In 1709, though, there was no warning that any of this was going to happen. Thousands and thousands of people died from hypothermia before anyone realized how serious the plummeting temperature was, and animals, including valuable livestock such as sheep, chickens, and cows, froze to death where they slept. And that was just the beginning. As the days dragged on and temperatures remained freezing, people and animals alike continued to struggle. Parisians were left to fend for themselves for 3 months, with no supplies able to get into the city. Snow blocked roads across the continent, and a number of rivers froze, with some seeing up to 11 inches of ice. Germany's hot springs froze too, along with Amsterdam's canals, Switzerland's lakes, and the Adriatic and Baltic seas. One small grace was that people were able to walk across these frozen lakes to search for food, but it may not have done them much good, and sometimes the frozen bodies of the dead became dinner. There are accounts of the cold being so overwhelming that trees cracked and shattered spontaneously, and church bells even stopped ringing because they'd crack and break if they tried. Wine froze in wine cellars of the rich, along with bread, meat, and what little food remained. As for the livestock, it was the cattle and other large animals who were the first to die. Soon enough, however, small wild animals were decimated too, and entire populations of wildlife were wiped out. Humanity hasn't really had a great track record when it comes to treating the world's poorest with any kind of respect, so it may not be entirely surprising to learn that, yes, Europe's poorest residents had it pretty bad during the Great Frost. What's more surprising, however, is that the rich fared little better. Europe's elite had spent a good long time building massive, sprawling palaces for themselves on huge estates that were kept more for decorative purposes than anything else. After all, practicality was something that only the peasants needed to concern themselves with.
Now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up! Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! I'm being repressed!
Take Versailles, for example. Louis XIV turned his father's hunting lodge into a palace in the 1670s, and as part of the renovations, he installed tall, wide windows that were specifically designed to impress anyone who saw them, but they didn't do much good for the weather. In the midst of the cold snap, the Duchess of Orleans was staying at Versailles and wrote, "The cold here is so fierce that it barely defies description. I am sitting by a roaring fire, have a screen before the door which is closed so that I can sit here with a fur around my neck, and I am still shivering and can barely hold the pen. Never in my life have I seen a winter such as this one." The winter of 1709 included the coldest month the continent had seen in 500 years. This was followed by 6 more cold snaps, where temperatures once again plummeted, and these freezing conditions lasted until March. By then, the ground was frozen, entire forests of trees were dead, and when temperatures finally rose again, the snow and ice melted, leading to devastating floods. Crops that should have been growing by spring were lost, famine spread, and inevitably, revolts flared up as a result. Between February and June of 1709, there were 155 instances of open rebellion in France alone, as starving people descended on any building that might have food left. Famine became just as bad as the cold, and according to one letter written by the sister-in-law of the French king, by June it was so bad that even the children had devoured each other. It's almost impossible to measure the long-term effects of such devastation, but a report in The Guardian recently suggested that England's entire agricultural economy was destroyed, with the GDP falling by a shocking 23%. It was around 10 years before the nation saw anything close to a rebound to pre-freeze conditions and productivity. Any historian will tell you that it's basically impossible to accurately pin huge historical events down to singular root causes. That said, it may be entirely possible that, had the Great Frost of 1709 never happened, Russia may never have become a superpower. And if that never happened, we'd never have gotten this.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
This story goes back to the beginning of the century and the so-called Great Northern War. This was the conflict that decided how the balance of power in Eastern Europe was going to fall, and it all came down to Sweden and Russia. At the time, Peter the Great's Russia had been making significant gains against Sweden, which was headed by the young and inexperienced Charles XII. During the Great Frost, the Swedish army suffered devastating losses to the cold. Around 20,000 Swedish soldiers died, and there were some nights that saw as many as 2,000 men perishing before the sun rose. Throw in a lack of supplies to weaken those who did survive, and the lead-up alone to the Battle of Poltava basically crippled the Swedish forces. Ultimately, the battle ended with Sweden being roundly defeated and Peter the Great becoming that much greater. Poltava is credited by many as being one of the key moments in Russian history, one that helped cement the country as a leading player in global politics. All in all, it really does seem like Russia's fortunes were spurned along by the bitter cold of winter, and not for the last time either. When the historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie sat down with Matteo France to discuss the Great Winter, he made it quite clear that, for all we know about the terrible cold spell, there's plenty we don't know too, including just how many people died. In a 1709 edition of the newspaper La Clef du Cabinet, this observation can be found. An infinite number of people died everywhere. Whole families were found to be frozen to death. Deaths didn't just come with the cold either, and for those who survived, there were other difficulties lurking in the months ahead. Leroy-Ladurie says that it's estimated around 100,000 people died immediately from the cold, and that's only in France. Then as many as 200,000 died in the famine that followed, and after that, there was another round of around 300,000 deaths. This last group perished as a result of their higher vulnerability to diseases they may have otherwise been able to survive, such as typhoid, smallpox, measles, dysentery, and even scurvy. Many also died from eating spoiled food or eating things that just aren't suitable as food, such as carrion. Suicide wasn't uncommon either, and many people were killed in the riots and rebellions that broke out across the country. In total, it's estimated that the Great Winter led to the deaths of some 600,000 people in France alone. The biggest mystery of the frost of 1709, however, is this: what actually caused it in the first place? One of the most frequently touted theories suggests that it had something to do with a phenomenon called the Maunder Minimum. Described by NASA as a time at which the sun entered a quiet phase, the Maunder Minimum technically occurred between 1645 and 1715. During this time, the sun became dimmer and calmer, and with fewer sunspots came less output, meaning that temperatures dropped across the Earth. The theory put forward by some climate scientists basically suggests that a decrease in energy received from the sun meant the formation of less ozone, which in turn impacted weather patterns such as the jet stream. That in turn impacted the presence of low and high pressure systems and resulted in particularly bad weather for that particular year. Makes sense, right? Well, not everyone thinks so. While some researchers suggest that decreased sunspot activity and solar radiation ought to lead to colder temperatures on Earth, others aren't so sure. Georg Fullner of the Potsdam Institute on Climate Change Research published research suggesting that the sun's output and surface activity has an insignificant impact on Earth's overall temperature, especially when compared to the impact of humankind on the climate. Fullner suggests that another period of decreased activity, such as the one seen around the deep freeze of 1709, would only lower the average temperature by about 0.1 of a degree Celsius. Unfortunately, if this climate model is to be believed, that means we're kind of back at square one. Some theorists have suggested that the Maunder Minimum may have had something to do with the frost of 1709, but not everything. In 2010, NASA's Ames Research Center solar physicist David Hathaway wrote that, to some extent, there is good evidence that activity on the sun's surface might cause fluctuations in the Earth's temperature. And here's the thing, these sun cycles actually happen pretty regularly, they're just different each time. Sun cycles occur about every 11 years, but they're always variable. For example, while it's impossible to know for sure, it has been theorized that for around 70 years, sunspot activity nearly stopped for good. This coincided with the centuries-long cooling period on Earth known as the Little Ice Age. Experts disagree on the exact dates of the Little Ice Age, but it's most commonly regarded as spanning from the 16th century to the 19th century. Robert McLachlan, a professor in applied mathematics at Massey University, claims that this 11-year sun cycle has been happening pretty regularly for hundreds of millions of years, and that, no, we're not entirely sure what makes it happen. Even in recent memory, we've seen both strong and weak sun cycles take place, including a strong one in the decade between 1954 and 1964, and a weak one in the period between 2009 and 2019. The problem here, however, is that these instances didn't lead to massive fluctuations in the weather. So what gives? Well, there are a few other theories about what caused the Little Ice Age, and by extension the winter of 1709. One suggests it all began with a series of volcanic eruptions that started at the end of the 13th century. A study by the University of Colorado found that it may have been possible that 4 massive volcanoes, which erupted between 1250 and 1300, filled the atmosphere with so much debris that it reflected solar energy away from the planet. This in turn led to lower temperatures that resulted in an expansion of the polar ice caps, causing temperatures to drop even further. While the study admits that it's impossible to calculate with any certainty just what kind of impact that would have had on the climate, it's entirely possible that a short burst of really cold weather was enough to kickstart the Little Ice Age. Others are doubtful, however, arguing that the cooling period in question just couldn't have had such drastic consequences. Researchers from the Norse-Norwegian Research Center have put forward one particularly novel theory for the cause of the Little Ice Age. Basically, that's life. These scientists say that sometimes climate models just behave strangely and there's no rhyme or reason for why events like this take place. They even have a name for these particular instances. They're called ugly ducklings because they seem to be completely wrong, even when they're not. The theory goes that just because we don't completely understand something doesn't mean it didn't happen. For example, when this group of researchers studied weather patterns from the beginning of the Little Ice Age, they found evidence that a huge section of sea ice had left the Arctic Ocean and headed for warmer climates. Why? Who knows? But that migration continued for the next 100 years, and the scientists suggest the impact that had on ocean currents and winds could have been enough to kickstart the Little Ice Age. Bottom line, the world is weird, life is unpredictable, and we're all just along for the ride.